Welcome, everyone. My name is Adela Ramos. I'm Director of Partnerships and Communications at the Tacoma Tree Foundation. And I want to begin by thanking you for joining us and also joining Dr. Kane. I can see my coworker, Jayla, on the screen. Hi, Jayla. You can just, if you just, hide your video. Thank you. And I'm going to go over our webinar logistics, tell you a little bit about TTF just in case you haven't heard from us before, and also introduce our speaker, do our land acknowledgement, and thank our Tacoma Creates for funding our webinar. So first of all, webinar logistics. We have the chat enabled so that you can communicate with me in case you experience any technical issues, but you cannot communicate with each other. We do have a Q&A, and so you should feel free to post your questions as we go through the presentation, and then I'll be reading them aloud to Dr. Kane at the end so that he can answer your questions. We hope that there are no technical issues, but if there are, we really appreciate your patience. If you are new to Tacoma Tree Foundation, we are a local nonprofit focused on reducing barriers to trees through community-based greening, especially in neighborhoods which have been historically redlined or underserved. And we are also committed to reducing barriers to tree care and science education, which is one of the reasons why we're here today. Tacoma is the city in Western Washington with the lowest tree canopy coverage at 20%. And we want every neighborhood in the greater Tacoma area to have a robust tree canopy sustained by strong neighborly relations where residents can experience a shared sense of stewardship for the urban forest. Our work in planting, education, and advocacy begins by acknowledging that our efforts to grow Tacoma's urban forest are needed in part due to the colonizing processes that undid the ancestral tribal stewardship of the original caretakers of the land where we live and work, the Puyallup tribe. We look to them for guidance on how to develop our work and begin by acknowledging that they are here. They continue to steward these lands where they make their home, speak the Lushootseed language, raise their children, and take care of their community, just as their ancestors did. We are able to offer today's webinar thanks to Tacoma Creates, who supports our education program through their grant. And I'm really excited that Dr. Brian Kane is with us again today. This is the second time that we're able to offer a webinar with Dr. Kane, so thanks for being here, Brian. Dr. Kane describes trees and the outdoors as a driving force in his life since childhood, and he is living out this passion in his work as a professor and arborist. He is an ISA Certified Arborist since 1977, a professor of commercial arboriculture endowed by the Massachusetts Arborist Association since 2004. He received the ISA Alex Shigo Award for Excellence in Arboriculture Education in 2014. And his expertise includes the effects of arboriculture practice, such as pruning and rigging, on the likelihood of tree failure. And he is also an expert in tree worker safety and is committed to outreach to the wider community. And in addition to this, he's also an avid bird watcher and has actually written about tree failure and birds. So if you're interested in birds as well, you should seek out his publication on these topics. Thank you for being here, Brian. I'm going to stop sharing so that you can continue. Okay, here we are.
Okay, great. Thank you, Adela. Just one quick point of note. In 1977, I was 7 years old, so I was not a certified arborist, and in fact, the certified arborist program didn't even exist. but that's a simple typo between the 70s and the 90s.
Yes.
So I mean, I look old, I'll give you that, but I just didn't want everybody to get a little bit panicked that I was going to like have a heart attack and keel over during this presentation. So I will forgive you for that, of course.
Yes, it is a total typo. Thanks for noting that.
That's pretty funny. Um, well, thank you for hosting again and for providing the opportunity for people to have a chance to learn a little bit more about trees in the community, and in particular about how we, as arborists and urban foresters, can try to manage them in such a way that we can maximize the benefits that those trees provide. And one way of doing that, probably the most important way, is to increase the canopy coverage. The greater percent of canopy coverage, or another way to think about it, is the more leaves you have in a community, in general, the benefits are going to accrue more rapidly. So we want to try to keep as many big trees around as possible, because big trees tend to have proportionally many more leaves, much greater leaf area. But we have to balance that, and this is a reality, we have to balance that with the potential risk associated with those trees. And in fact, as trees get larger, their potential for risk increases, because they have more parts of them that might fail, and the parts are larger, and so they can do more damage if they were to impact some sort of a target. So we want to keep as many trees, and especially big trees, around in the community to provide benefits, but we have to balance that. And so one of the things that arborists do, and the ISA has done a really good job of trying to reduce the amount of bias or subjectivity in risk assessment. Arborists try to understand and quantify the amount of risk a tree presents. And I'm going to go through that in a lot more detail in a second. But one of the things they're looking for is the process should be as standardized as possible to minimize the amount of uncertainty and variability. Those things are impossible to eliminate entirely. This process of risk assessment will always be, kind of governed in some way by an individual's experience and an individual's background, and their assessment of trees can't help but be part of, an individual's process. So ISA has done a good job of standardizing and minimizing the amount of subjectivity, but it hasn't gone away completely, and it's not going to go away completely. So the reason we undertook this project that I'm going to just cover today is we want to try to get a better sense of how subjectivity can influence the way arborists assess. In particular, this one factor is looking at the likelihood of failure when there is decay present in a tree. Risk assessment is much, much bigger than this as a process, but for the sake of today's presentation and realistic time limits, we're just going to focus on this one project that we worked on. Just a quick acknowledgement of the funding sources that went into this presentation and this project. The Tree Fund has supported a lot of the work we've done at UMass over the years, and they gave us a grant to work on this project. They supported the graduate student, and also the Massachusetts Arborist Association, who has funded my position at the University of Massachusetts. Without their support, I probably would have a job somewhere, but I would not have a job at UMass in all likelihood. And then last, but certainly not least, all of the folks who participated in this study, this is going back to July of 2021. We had 18 or so individuals who took time out of their professional schedules in the middle of the growing season to spend a few days at UMass. And so that's no small donation of time. when you're especially a small business owner. So we really appreciate them and all of the people you see listed here who helped out with the project in many ways. Just in case we run out of time today for questions, or if you think of something that you want to ask later on, please don't hesitate to send me an email. That's the best way to get a hold of me, and I'm usually pretty responsive. So please don't hesitate. Happy to try to help. And then as a kind of outline or an overview of what we want to cover today, I'll leave some time for questions at the end. I'll just spend a little bit of time introducing decay, which is one of the more common defects that trees in a developed landscape have in them for a variety of reasons. And then the process of risk assessment. Again, you don't have to be a qualified risk assessor, but I'll just go through some of the very basics of that. And then some of the tools that arborists use, and in particular we use during this research project, and then talk about how decay increases the likelihood of failure, and then go through the experiment itself. I'd like to try to spend as much time as possible on the results, but I think it's also important to cover some of these introductory topics, especially if you don't have a lot of experience doing risk assessments. It'll be important to kind of understand those basics. Whenever a tree gets wounded, this can occur from a piece of machinery backing into a tree, or vandalism, or even a good pruning cut, but certainly bad pruning cuts. Anything that wounds the tree, opens up the bark, and exposes the wood, can lead to some amount of decay. And so the amount of decay that forms depends on this process called compartmentalization of decay in trees. And so the short version of that is coated. Coated is a complicated process that is an exchange or an interaction between the tree and microorganisms that are in the environment. And most of the microorganisms that are related to decay formation are fungi. There are some others. We're not going to, again, get into too many details here, but it's primarily fungi. And really, the coated process is kind of this back and forth between different species of fungi trying to digest the wood and cellular components of the wood in the tree, and the tree responding by creating either chemical or physical, like anatomical changes to the cellular structure of the wood to slow down or stop that process of digestion by fungi. So it will depend on the growing conditions for the tree, the growing conditions for fungi, how healthy the tree is, the species. I mean, there's a lot of different factors, but it really does come down to this kind of back and forth where the tree is trying to slow down or stop digestion of wood, and the fungi are trying different tactics or different species to digest the cellular components. When a tree has been wounded and that decay process starts, how much decay ends up occurring depends on those factors I just mentioned. So the species of tree, the species of fungus or fungi, the growing conditions, et cetera, how healthy the tree is, how old the tree is. One of two things, or maybe one of three things, is going to happen. You'll end up, as in this previous slide, with a hollow tree, or you'll end up with some amount of decay in the cross section. And so the tree doesn't have to be completely decayed for the likelihood of failure to increase. Any sort of digestion of the cellular components, even a very kind of what we call incipient decay, like the very beginnings of cellular digestion, that can reduce pretty dramatically the strength of the wood. So if you can see decay, if you can, like if you were looking at this tree before it failed and you could see the decayed wood, or you could touch the decay and feel that it was kind of soft and punky, then the wood strength is effectively zero at that point. And so even if it's not hollow, we should assume that the tree basically, or the wood, has almost, if not any strength left in it. The increase of the likelihood of failure, either because the tree's hollow and there's a lot less wood, or because the wood itself is decayed, and even though it's present, it doesn't have a whole lot of strength left, that increases the likelihood of failure, because in this highlighted text here, you can see the likelihood of failure of a tree part, whether it's a branch or a trunk or even the roots, basically depends on the loads that the part of the tree experiences, and then the load-bearing capacity that the tree has. That load-bearing capacity obviously is going to be reduced when there's decay present. Now, if we backtrack kind of upwards here from this likelihood of failure, the reason that stuff is highlighted is that's what we're going to focus on today, this likelihood of failure due to decay. But the process of risk assessment, when you are trying to understand the risk a tree presents, it's not just the likelihood of failure. And this is a common misconception that people who don't deal with trees regularly don't fully appreciate necessarily. So if you see a tree that has a lot of decay, you might think, oh man, there's a really high likelihood of failure. And that may in fact be true, but unless you are kind of carefully thinking about these other factors, in particular, the likelihood of impact, and then above that, the severity of the consequences, you really can't assess risk by looking at just the likelihood of failure. You have to understand both the likelihood of failure and the likelihood of impact. That's how likely is the tree to fail, and if it does fail, how likely is it going to hit something? And then, depending on what that something is and how big the tree part is, what consequences are going to occur? Are they going to be severe consequences like the loss of life? Or are they going to be negligible consequences like, landing on the roof of a building and maybe, scratching the paint or something like that? So without understanding all of those factors, failure, impact, and consequences, it's not possible to have a good sense of the risk that a tree presents. Let me just take one step back to kind of talk about loads and load-bearing capacity. The most common loads that cause tree failure, to some extent, it depends on where you live, but most of the time, the force of the wind, which is called drag, that's a very common cause of tree failure. In some places, especially where ice storms occur, with some regularity, those can be major storm effects and loads on trees. And then, especially if you're an arborist, if you have worked in trees before, you know that there is some likelihood, it's usually not high if you're working carefully, but there is some likelihood that the loads you exert on the tree, whether climbing or if you're working in a tree like rigging it, that those loads can be substantial as well. The load-bearing capacity of the tree is going to depend on how much cross-sectional area there is and how strong the wood is. And so this is where you can see decay can affect both of those things. A hollow tree is going to have less wood, and the strength of the wood itself is going to be less when it's decayed. Kind of preempted my slide there, but that's basically the take-home message when decay is present. One last thing about likelihood of failure and decay. Decay reduces the load-bearing capacity, and everything else being equal, that's going to increase the likelihood of failure. Just because decay is present doesn't mean that the likelihood of failure is like meaningful, because if the tree doesn't experience very many loads or the loads aren't that high, then the likelihood of failure might not change very much at all. So we need to assess both the loads the tree experiences or will experience, as well as the load-bearing capacity. When decay is present in a stem, in a branch, in a trunk, in a root, the amount of decay and the location of that decay both influence the likelihood of failure, because they both influence the loss in load-bearing capacity. So if you look at these two pictures here, let's just assume that both of them have lost about 50% of their of the wood that's in the trunk. It's not going to be exactly correct, but the important comparison between these two pictures is that the amount of decay looks pretty similar in both of those cross sections. However, the location is very different. So if we look at this image on the left, the location of the decay is pretty much right in the center. The location of the decay on the right is way off to the side, and there is a much greater loss in load-bearing capacity when the decay is not in the center of the tree. So the closer the decay gets to the outer part of the stem, again, it doesn't matter if it's a branch, a trunk, or a root, the closer the decay gets out there, the greater reduction in load-bearing capacity. So amount and location of decay will both influence the loss in load-bearing capacity. If you have done risk assessments before, especially if you do a lot of them, you're going to be familiar with many of, if not all of these tools. If you haven't, this is just a quick overview to talk about the different kinds of tools that arborists use when they are trying to assess decay. The simplest, but oftentimes the most useful tool is your pair of eyes. And so you can look, especially with good experience, you can look at a tree, and oftentimes that's all you need in order to assess how much decay is present. If you're unsure, or if you want to confirm your suspicion based on a visual inspection, you can also use a mallet, like a rubber or a plastic mallet, and tap the side of the trunk or the branch and listen for changes in the resonance of that trunk or branch. If there's an open cavity in the trunk, you can take a probe, like a metal probe, and kind of poke into that cavity, into the decay, to get a sense of how deep the cavity is. You can also use tools like increment corers, handheld resistance drills. There are some more sophisticated drills up in here. This tool is a more sophisticated drill that basically pushes a bit in through the wood at a fixed rate of speed and kind of plots how much resistance the wood offers. As you get even more sophisticated and more expensive, you've got things like sonic tomography, which is the image on the bottom here. And then there are even tools like radar that probably not terribly common in use, but they do exist. So there's a lot of simple tools, and they range up into very, very sophisticated and very expensive tools to try to help arborists understand the amount and the location of the decay. That was a really quick overview. And again, we could spend quite a bit of time on probably all of those slides, but we want to make sure we get through this experiment and the results, and then have some time for questions at the end. So a quick overview of the experiment that my grad student conducted. We had 18 track risk assessors. So if you're not familiar with the term, track is the ISA's tree risk assessment qualification. And in order to become a track assessor, you need to go through basically 2 days of training, if you, I think it's a 3-year period, then you have to retake your training. It's a fairly rigorous process. Again, with the idea of trying to reduce the amount of subjectivity in that's going to be present to some extent in the assessors who are doing this work. So we had 18 people with the track qualification, and we asked them over this 2-day period at the UMass campus a few years ago. We asked them to assess the likelihood of trunk failure due to the presence of decay in 30 different trees that were on campus. And we asked them to do 5 assessments of each tree. So I'll go through the assessments and the process in a little more detail in a second. But basically, everybody as a group visited tree 1 and assessed its likelihood of failure 5 times in a row. Then everybody moved to tree 2, to tree 3, et cetera. And so each assessment was predicated to some extent on the previous assessment. There are 5 consecutive assessments of the likelihood of failure from each participant for each of these 30 trees. The 5 different assessment, let's call them assessment methods or assessment techniques, are the ones that are listed in bullet points here, and I'll go through them in a little more detail. But it's basically quick. First, doing a visual assessment. Second, sounding the trunk with a mallet. Third, examining the output from that resistance drill tool that's shown here. Fourth, looking at a tomogram. And then fifth is consulting with another participant in the group. So after each one of these, each participant gave a likelihood of failure rating. One of the key things about the track program, Tree Risk Assessment Qualification, is that there has to be a standard time frame when you are doing a risk assessment. So it doesn't matter what time frame you choose. You might choose 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Usually people don't choose too many more than that. Like 5 years is kind of about the maximum, because it starts to get much harder to predict, 5 years out, whether a storm is going to occur and that sort of thing. So we just selected a 3-year time frame for this experiment. You could, as a risk assessor, you could select any time frame you want within reason. The likelihood of failure ratings are these 4 categories here. So improbable, there's a definition for that, possible, probable, and then imminent. Imminent basically means the tree is about to fail. So we're not going to have any of those trees. They're they're very, very rare. So it's not like you're going to come across a lot of them. I'm not going to read these definitions here. They're part of the track process, and the people who participate in the study obviously are very familiar. There are 2 things that each definition includes. Those 2 factors are the likelihood of failure occurring within this time frame, 3-year period is what we chose, under normal weather conditions, and then what we call extreme or severe or extreme weather conditions. So each of those definitions will have a consideration of likelihood of failure under normal weather and then under severe or extreme weather. Each of these assessment methods or assessment techniques followed this same pattern. So the first is a visual assessment. Unfortunately, grad student didn't do a great job taking pictures while he was conducting the experiment. He was super busy, so I kind of let him off the hook. But the pictures were not taken, these pictures were taken in the wintertime. We did this experiment in the growing season, so obviously all the trees had leaves on them. The first step, the first assessment is a visual assessment. So everybody visited trees 1 through 30. and they looked at the tree to assess likelihood of failure based on what the tree looks like, and that will again be a focus on, is there decay in the trunk, and also get a sense of how healthy the tree is and how exposed it is to different loads. So you want to know that the likelihood of the tree being exposed to a strong wind coming from a particular direction. So we made sure that the arborists who participated focused on this section right here, basically the trunk and likelihood of failure, but really right down here towards the bottom. And I'll show you why in a second. People were allowed to look at the whole tree, obviously, and get a sense of the overall health and the exposure of the tree. But when they did their likelihood of failure ratings, it was only due to decay in the trunk. So we didn't want them to worry about assigning a likelihood of failure rating for somewhere else in the tree based on a different defect. The second level of assessment, the second assessment technique, is using the mallet. You can see one of the participants here holding a mallet, plastic mallet, and tapping the trunk to listen for the presence of decay. The third level of assessment, or the third method of assessment, is viewing the output from the resistance drill. So what you see here, and I know it's a little bit hard to read this stuff, but we didn't ask participants to use a resistance drill to figure out how much decay was there. We did this, my grad student Ari did this all in advance. And so he created these sheets here that are showing the outline of the trunk of the tree at basically about half a meter above the root flare. And he put in how much sound wood is present, as well as how much decayed wood is present. So all of these straight lines going into the cross section, those are all places where he used the resistance drill to drill in and measure whether there was decay or not. This table up top here just shows what's known as the TR ratio, and that's the thickness of sound wood to the radius of the trunk of the tree. And each of those numbers there gives a sense to the arborist how much potential for too much decay is present. The fourth method, the fourth level of assessment, is viewing the tomograms. Now, there are two different kinds of tomograms. There's sonic resistance and electrical resistance. So the one on the left here is sonic tomography, and the one on the right is electrical resistance tomography. I know very little about tomography, so I'll try to answer any questions about it, but I'm not going to do a great job with that. Basically, what you need to understand about tomography is that these colors, so starting with the blue and then kind of working outwards to this purplish and then greenish, depending on settings in the tomography tool, those indicate whether decay is present. And it's basically a likelihood scale. So when you see that blue color, that's you can be pretty confident that there's decay present. Depending on the settings, as you change the colors, the confidence that you have that there is decay starts to go down. And so when you're out in this tan and brown, that's a pretty high confidence in the other direction, that there isn't very much decay present. The final assessment technique is consulting with one of the other participants. And so we had an even number, 18 people participated. So after the first 4 assessments, everybody paired up, and we had kind of pre-assigned in a random fashion who would be working with whom, and they would again assess likelihood of failure, assign a likelihood of failure rating after talking with one of the other participants. about their thoughts on the tree. It was not required that both of the pair came up with the same likelihood of failure. It was just an opportunity to discuss the information that had been gathered. And so hopefully what you can see is that there's cumulatively more and more and more information about decay with each of these assessments. And the last one, this fifth one, is okay, let me talk to somebody else after I've looked at all of these other tools and listened with the mallet to get a sense of how much decay I think is present. A rundown of the participants. So 18 people, everybody held the track credential. The average time that they held it was 6 years. There were 7 board certified master arborists. Excuse me. There were 7 registered consulting arborists. 12 people had an advanced degree in arboriculture. Everybody conducted risk assessments as part of their job, but their experience as a risk assessor ranged quite a bit from 1 year to over 35 years. Everyone had a fair amount of experience as an arborist. This 1 year of experience was as a tree risk assessor. The person had been an arborist for many years, but had only specifically done risk assessments for a year. The estimated number of trees ranged quite a bit. We had some people who were consulting arborists, and so for a lot of them, they did many fewer trees, but they investigated them much more thoroughly. We also had some municipal arborists, and they did a lot of what we call a level 1 risk assessment, which is basically you can drive by, hundreds of trees and kind of look at them as you're driving by and get a sense of how likely they are to fail, and then give them a risk assessment rating. So some people did quite a few of those lower level investigations. Others did fewer investigations, but a much more thorough investigation. All of the participants, this slide is important because the factors here become important in the results. So all of the participants were familiar with the different techniques that we just went through. So using a sounding mallet, using a resistance recording a drill, and using sonic tomography. Everybody was familiar with how to do that, with how to interpret that. But the frequency that they used those tools varied quite a bit, especially with the more sophisticated tools. So if you look at the first 2 rows here in this table, how frequently do you do visual risk assessments and how frequently do you use a mallet? Almost everybody said often. And that's kind of what we were hoping for because we wanted people who did a lot of risk assessments. As we get into the more sophisticated techniques, using a resistance recording drill and using sonic tomography, you can see that the numbers start to go way down. So less than half of the people often used a resistance recording drill or sonic tomography. A few more use them occasionally. Some of them use them rarely or even never. So everybody was familiar with the tools, but not everybody used them with regularity. That will turn out to be important. Here are the summary of the trees. They were mostly oaks, one group of white pines. They're mostly large trees. This was intentional because we had one of my colleagues, Nick Brzee, had previously done the tomography on all of these trees. So he's been working on a separate project looking at tomography in trees, and he basically does a lot of these big old trees that are on campus. A summary of the results without going into details. Which of the factors that we measured, which of them influenced the ratings, the likelihood of failure ratings that assessors assigned? First one, the assessment technique. So one of those 5 techniques will end up, I'll show you in a second, will end up being different in terms of the likelihood of failure ratings that people gave. The assessors themselves also were a factor, in particular, how frequently they used tomography and how frequently they used a resistance drill influenced their likelihood of failure ratings. And then lastly, the trees themselves, in particular, the percent area of decay and the kind of reciprocal of that, which is the average sound wood thickness. And I'll show you more details on each of these. But this is the kind of overall pattern to get a sense of the things that influenced how people rated likelihood of failure. Looking at the assessment technique, the next several slides are going to have graphs that look pretty much like this. The color scheme is to indicate the different likelihood of failure ratings. So black is probable likelihood of failure, orange is possible likelihood of failure, and then blue is improbable likelihood of failure. And across the horizontal axis, the different techniques. So first the visual, then the mallet, then using a drill, then using the tomogram, and then the consultation with a peer. And what you can hopefully see is the amount of blue, orange, and black is fairly consistent for all of the techniques except using the tomogram. And so using the tomogram, the amount of probable, or the proportion of probable likelihood of failures is pretty much twice as large as any of the other techniques. And accordingly, the amount of, or the proportion of improbable likelihood of failure ratings is much less than the other techniques. So the one technique that influenced likelihood of failure ratings is the tomogram. And in general, what it shows is that when assessors looked at the tomograms, they tended to give higher likelihood of failure ratings. There were more probables and fewer improbables. Now looking at the assessors, the two particulars here are frequency of using the drill and frequency of using tomography for doing risk assessments. So it's the same color scheme with probable, possible, and improbable. Now the horizontal axis is how often do you use a resistance drill? Never, rarely, occasionally, and often. Again, what you see is that there's a difference primarily in the occasional group where there's a lot more probable ratings. There's also quite a bit in the never category, but there's a lot fewer in the often. So people who more often used the resistance drill, they used it fairly regularly, they tended to rate lower likelihood of failures. There's quite a bit more improbable. It looks like it's over 60% of the ratings for the people who most often used resistance recording drills ended up being less concerned and therefore having lower likelihood of failure ratings. That's not true of occasionally. It's not true of never. And even with rarely, you can see there's a lot more possibles and not terribly many improbables. Similar pattern now with the frequency of using tomography. So focusing on the proportion of improbables, the blue, it's highest, again, over 60%. It's highest for the people who most often used tomography. We didn't ask them to quantify this, but this is a self-assessment, basically. How often Do you use it? So we didn't say like often is once a week, twice a week, or whatever. This is basically their self-assessment. But once again, there's a lot fewer improbables, especially with never and rarely using that tomography tool, and a lot more of them when people use tomography frequently. So that basically means they are assigning lower likelihood of failure ratings when they use tomography more often. Influence of the tree on the likelihood of failure rating. Two things, again, basically related to the amount of decay that's present. So the percent area of decay, as well as the average sound wood thickness. This graph has it's a lot more busy, I apologize. It has the same color scheme though, and basically the horizontal axis now is just the average sound wood thickness. So you can see the smallest amount of sound wood is 5 inches, and the largest amount of sound wood is up at 17.5 inches. Not surprisingly, for this 5 inches of sound wood, most of the people, over 60% of the assessors, rated it as a probable likelihood of failure. There's a couple of things that kind of stand out as outliers, though, in that here's a tree that doesn't have a huge amount of sound wood, and yet it has a lot of improbables. So the general pattern is that there should be more blue as you go to the right-hand side of the graph, and more orange and black as you go to the left-hand side of the graph. And as a general trend, that's true, but it's not a perfect trend by any means. When we look at the percent of decay, we should see the exact opposite. We should see more blue on the left-hand side, and then as you go follow right, at the most percent decay, so up 70%, you should see a lot more black and orange. But again, way up at the top here, there's a couple of trees that had fairly substantial decay, 66%, 71%, and still people, by and large, rated them as improbable. So more than 70% of the ratings here are improbables, even with this amount of decay. That could be due to things like the exposure that the tree has to loads, or it could be to factors of the participants not fully understanding what they were looking at, their lack of familiarity in terms of how frequently they used tomography or resistance drills. So all of those things potentially are going to be interacting with one another when we're looking at things like the assessor and the trees themselves. One other thing that's very interesting is that assessors sometimes changed their ratings after gaining new information with each of the assessment techniques, but other times that was not true. And so I just want to show a couple of graphs here before I stop for questions to ask how ratings changed for different trees and for different assessors. So we're gonna start with the trees first, because some of these are helpful to see what the tree looked like and how people changed or didn't change their ratings for each of the different techniques. So the color scheme here is different. What we're looking at is the 4 techniques after the visual assessment. So now you don't see the visual assessment on the horizontal axis. We see mallet, drill, tomogram, and consultation. The color scheme now is the ratings decreased, which is this kind of cream color. This blue color is the ratings stayed the same. And then this burnt orange color is ratings increased. This is relative to the initial visual assessment. So for most of the techniques except tomogram, you can see the ratings were pretty much the same from that initial visual assessment. This tells us, this graph really shows pretty clearly, wow, after people use the tomogram, they were much more likely to change their opinion about the likelihood of failure. And in particular, it increased. So the proportion of increased ratings was much greater. It's almost, it's 35% or so ratings increased. Whereas for most of the other ones, it's less than 20%. In some cases, less than 15%. There are 4 trees that caused problems and 4 trees that didn't cause problems in terms of people changing their mind. These 4 trees here, 8, 16, 24, and 29, pretty much people had the same likelihood of failure rating regardless of the technique. So they picked the visual, they got a likelihood of failure rating, and then for each of the subsequent 4, they didn't really change their minds. Those are these trees here. Tree number 8, visual assessment on the right, looking at the resistance drill and the tomogram, pretty much showing no decay. There's no evidence of decay in the pictures either. So not surprising, people didn't change their mind. Same thing with tree 16. No signs visually of decay. The tomogram and the resistance drill show the same thing. Here's the opposite situation where there are some signs on the trunk. The tomogram kind of confirms that. So these ratings were generally higher, but they didn't change from the initial visual assessment. Same thing is true of this tree where there's a substantial amount or a fair amount of decay. There's obvious signs in the trunk. People didn't really change their minds. These trees were the trees that changed the most. And the instances here, tree ratings increased. So looking at the trunk, looking at the tree, no real signs of obvious decay, but then looking at the resistance drill and the tomogram and sounding it with a mallet, all of a sudden people appreciated how much decay was present and increased their ratings. Same thing is true of this tree. These 2 trees are the opposite. These 2 trees, the rating decreased. Obviously, with this tree, there's not a lot of signs of decay, but people are concerned, presumably, with the lean in this tree. There's no decay in the stem, and both the tomogram and the resistance drilling show that. So the ratings, once people learned this, the ratings went down. Same thing is true of this tree, where there's instances of decay when you first see it, but when you're looking at the tomogram and the resistance drill, you're like, well, that doesn't really change that much. So you're less likely to be worried about that likelihood of failure. I'm not going to point out, I know we're running short on time here, and I'm not going to point out, we keep our raters, participants anonymous, but there are 4 people who basically never changed their mind after their assessment of the visual. Most of the time, 60, 70, 80% of the time, they didn't change their mind. We don't know who they are. There wasn't a good explanation for why they never changed their mind. These 4 assessors were much more likely. So it's almost half the time, either they increased their ratings or they decreased their ratings, depending on who they were. Those 2 slides there, the people who didn't change and the people who did change, that shows me, and I think this is a good place to stop, that shows how important 8 out of the 18, the psychology of risk assessment. So we need to do a lot more to understand why some of these things happen. But until we get to that point, it's really important to understand if you're doing risk assessments or if you're asking people to do risk assessments, that there is some level of subjectivity that really is going to be hard to completely eliminate, completely diminish, let alone eliminate, because it is a subjective process. And especially if you're not familiar with using tools, using them can be a problem, can definitely influence the ratings. So I'm going to stop there because I know we have a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that incredibly nuanced presentation that is going to help us also answer some questions that we often get about how these assessments are made. We have at least one question, no, two. So I'm going to begin at the top. These results seem far more variable than I would have expected given the level of experience of those assessors. What does this indicate to you about failure rating ISA? Or do you think folks were used to doing the other risk steps and were looking beyond what you asked them to do?
That's a good question. My interpretation of the results and the variability in particular, and other studies have shown a similar finding to this, is that at the extremes, for trees that are either rated imminent or rated improbable, there's far less variability. It's the probable possible that tend to cause a lot more challenges. And even though there are pretty explicit guidelines when you go through the track training about what it means to be a possible likelihood of failure and what it means to be a probable likelihood of failure, I mean, that is kind of drummed into you during the training. It still is a qualitative assessment. And even with those really sophisticated tools, it doesn't necessarily help you that much. So I think we have to, unless we get a lot more information, we have to accept that some level of variability, especially in the middle, in that probable and possible category. The other thing that I didn't mention, but this is a good point to say this, none of the trees that we looked at failed in the subsequent 3 years. One of them was taken down preemptively, basically, but a probable likelihood of failure rating means that the tree has a good likelihood of failure in some kind of a severe weather event. So like a strong thunderstorm or a hurricane or an ice storm. And we have had those kinds of events on campus over the last 3 or 4 years. So it also, to me, I'm not saying anybody had the right answer in terms of whether this is a possible or a probable. This is just showing, as that question asked, like, this is a level of variability that we're gonna be stuck with, I think, for quite some time. And I think most assessors appreciate and acknowledge that. I don't think people would really like kind of stick to their guns, but I have to say, again, given that 4 people, the vast majority of the time, did not change their opinion. Nothing that was given, new information was given to them, didn't change their mind, makes me a little bit cautious about how I think of individuals and risk assessments.
Thanks, Brian. We have 3 more. So if you have a little bit of time to stay afternoon, great. Okay, awesome. We have one that asks, was lean of tree part of the assessments?
The lean of the tree is kind of inherently part of the assessment when you are thinking about likelihood of failure of the trunk. And that's because when a tree is leaning, its weight is off center, and so there's going to be bending associated with it. A good assessor, a thoughtful or careful assessor, will look not just at the lean of the trunk, but will try to assess the center of gravity of the tree and where the center of gravity is. Because even if the trunk might be leaning a little bit, if the tree, the crown of the tree kind of curves back up and is mostly plumb with the root flare, then the lean of the trunk has less of an effect. But people were doing that because you want to know if there's a little bit of an extra a bending moment on that trunk because the center of gravity is off center and it's making the tree experience greater loads. One other follow-up to that is that if the tree is recently leaning, that's a very different situation than if the tree appears to have been leaning for many years and has grown what we call response growth to compensate for the fact that it is leaning somehow. And a lot of times that lean can be, phototropism. It's basically the tree just trying to get to the light. And under those circumstances, it's not nearly as much of a concern as if the tree is recently leaning and it's basically just fully leaning, which indicates that there might be some kind of problem with the root system and the tree hasn't been able to respond to that new situation.
The next question is, are there other environmental indicators that might demonstrate decay or tree failure?
The most common visual assessments that people are looking for is kind of abnormal bark texture. Obviously, if there's an open cavity, if like there's an open wound, things like fruiting bodies, although those can be challenging because they oftentimes are not persistent. So, depending on the growing conditions for the fungi, there could be plenty of decay, but if the growing conditions aren't right to produce spores, you won't see mushrooms, you won't see fruiting bodies and that sort of thing. Other things to look for is activity of wildlife like birds, cavity nesting birds, which frequently use decayed wood. The presence of carpenter ants. Carpenter ants are not bad for the tree. They make their nests, they're excavating only decayed wood. So if you see a lot of carpenter ants or if you see the buildup of sawdust at the base of the tree, that's an indication that insects are taking advantage of decayed wood in the tree. So visual assessments can often tell you quite a bit. And the more sophisticated techniques oftentimes aren't even used because you really don't need it. You can get a sense pretty easily with your eyes and maybe your ears if you want to sound the trunk.
Thanks, Brian. And finally, should there be a requirement for type of tool used based on age, height, or type of tree?
Oh, another good question. I would say, like, my gut instinct is to say no on that. Um, Most of the time, when you are doing risk assessments, the trees are going to be a certain size because if the tree is small enough, the risk is almost always going to be negligible or really, really low. So, most of the time the trees are going to be of a certain size just because that's when you start to get concerned about the damage that might be done, the consequences of a failed tree. Um, it really is an assessor's judgment to know what might be the best tool or tools to use. And again, more often than not, the simple assessment, using your eyes, using your ears, maybe, using a probe to feel, those senses that you have more often than not are going to be perfectly sufficient. And you can get a pretty good sense of the amount of decay and the likelihood of failure with the simple assessment. It's it's trees that are particularly significant, let's say, in some way, that also appear to have a substantial amount of decay. It's usually those kinds of circumstances when somebody will use a more sophisticated tool, like resistance drilling or tomography. The reason that people sometimes or people are less likely to use those sophisticated tools is because it will be an extra cost both in time and in money for the client, who then, may or may not care so much about the tree where they're really worried about I really want to retain this tree or part of it because it has some significance to me, historical significance, cultural significance, whatever. It's under those circumstances that the more sophisticated and costly techniques get implemented because the client, the tree owner or the tree manager is willing to spend more because almost always it's because they really want to hold on to the tree. They really want to retain the tree for some reason.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much. That was our last question. And you're just getting a thank you from the audience as well. Thanks for being here, everyone. And we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Thank you, Brian.